The first mortar hit the relay tower at 6:11, and by 6:14 Sergeant Cade Morrow had lost comms with every unit north of the ridgeline. He pulled the headset off, checked the frequency selector one more time out of habit, and set it on the dirt beside the junction box he'd spent 2 hours wiring into a Draivek field router. The junction box was functional. The relay tower, 100 meters upslope, was not. It was a scatter of blackened alloy and a column of smoke that the desert wind pulled east into the canyon. The Draivek relay network had been designed by committee, which meant it had 17 redundancies on paper, and none that mattered when the first real shell landed. Morrow stood, brushed the red dust off his forearms, and looked south. The valley opened below in a long, shallow bowl of fractured basalt and dry scrub. The Tessavari Corridor, the locals called it, though the locals had been evacuated 9 days ago when the Kethren Dominion's forward columns crossed the mineral flats. The corridor ran 14 kilometers between two ridgelines of wind-carved stone, narrowing and widening like the throat of something ancient. At the southern mouth, the combined garrison 3 Draivek infantry platoons, a Draivek support section, and Morrow's 4-person coalition engineering team had been holding a forward outpost designated Waypoint Sable. The outpost consisted of a perimeter wall of stacked mining slag, 2 automated sentry positions, a medical bay that was really just a supply tent with a cot, and a communications relay that no longer existed. Morrow walked to the edge of the cut and looked down at the outpost. 50 meters below, figures moved between the slag walls in the pale gold light of the Verasi 3 morning. Draivek soldiers, tall, lean, their chitin plates ranging from slate gray to deep charcoal, segmented limbs moving with the precise, angular efficiency that made them look like they'd been assembled rather than born. Most of them were checking weapons. A few were staring north at the ridgeline, where the smoke was. He keyed the short-range tactical set clipped to his vest. "Hollies, comms are gone. Relay scrap." The response came back in 2 seconds. "Copy, long range 2. Everything north. Short range still works below the ridge shadow, but we're talking to each other and nobody else." A beat of silence, then, "So nobody's coming." "Not unless someone walks out." Corporal Dana Hollies was at the base of the outpost's eastern wall, crouched behind a barrier of welded mining rail with her demolition kit open, and a dozen shaped charges laid out on the ground like she was doing inventory at a hardware store. She was, in a professional sense. Hollies had been a combat engineer for 11 years, and before that she'd been a structural demolitions contractor in the mineral belt back on Earth. She approached explosives the way a carpenter approached lumber, with professional calm, a strong opinion about grain, and no patience for people who didn't secure their load-bearing walls. Her hands moved over the charges with a familiarity that bordered on affection, checking primers, confirming detonator compatibility, sorting by yield. "What about the Draivek command net?" she asked, not looking up. "Their net runs through the same relay. They're cut off too." Holly set down the charge she'd been inspecting, wiped her palms on her trousers, and looked north toward the smoke. Her face was the color of sun-baked clay, and there was red dust in the creases around her eyes. She was 41 years old. She looked exactly like someone who had spent 22 of those years making things and unmaking them, and who understood the difference between the two more intimately than most people understood anything. "So we hold until they dig us out, or we march." "We march, 41 kilometers south to the nearest coalition relay. Across open ground. Through the corridor. That's their axis of advance, Sarge." "I know what it is." Morrow descended the cut, loose stone shifting under his boots. At the base, he found Lieutenant Veshkari waiting. The Draivek officer stood rigid at the junction of the eastern and southern walls, his amber compound eyes scanning the northern approach with a mechanical regularity that looked almost automated. His rank was indicated by 3 horizontal grooves filed into the chitin plate above his left eye cluster. Morrow had learned to read those markings in his first week on planet, the same way he'd learned to read the clicking sounds their mandibles made when stress hormones flooded their hemolymph. Each click was a data point. Rapid clicking meant the adrenaline analog was flooding the system. Slow clicking meant calculation. Silence meant the officer had moved past both into territory that had no Draivek word for it. Veshkari's mandibles were clicking rapidly now. Sergeant Morrow. The Draivek officer's voice came through the translation membrane stretched across his lower jaw. The membrane turned the harmonic clicks of Draivek's speech into flat, slightly metallic English. The relay. Gone, Morrow said. Direct hit. The Kethren have spotters on the eastern ridge, probably with targeting data. They know exactly what they hit and they know we're deaf now. Then we cannot signal for extraction. No. Veshkari's compound eyes shifted, a subtle rotation of hundreds of facets that Morrow had learned to interpret as calculation. Not panic. Draivek officers didn't panic the way humans understood the word. They calculated. They ran probabilities. They weighed the math against doctrine, and when doctrine provided an answer, they followed it with the same mechanical certainty that drove their segmented legs. And when the probabilities turned unfavorable, they made a sound, a low, resonant harmonic from deep in the thorax that meant the math had failed them. Morrow heard that sound now. The nearest coalition relay is 41 kilometers south, Veshkari said, across open ground, through the corridor. I know. The Kethren forward elements will reach this position within 3 hours. Their main column is 6 hours behind. We observed vehicle dust plumes on the northern horizon at dawn. I know that too. Then you understand that this outpost cannot be held. Morrow looked at the lieutenant. Veshkari was taller than him by 30 centimeters, his chitin plates the color of wet slate, his compound eyes reflecting the morning light in fractured amber patterns. He was a competent officer. Morrow had served under worse human and otherwise. I understood that before the relay went down, sir. What I need to know is whether your platoons can move. Veshkari's mandibles clicked twice sharp, involuntary. Second platoon sustained casualties in the shelling. 7 wounded, 2 of them critical. First platoon is intact. Third platoon is spread along the western approach and can collapse within 10 minutes. How fast can your intact units move across broken terrain? Draivek standard march pace on this surface, 4 kilometers per hour. Sustained. And the wounded. A pause. Morrow watched the officer's compound eyes rotate again, and he knew exactly what calculation was being run. He'd seen it before. On Thessic 4 with the Korvathi. On Pale Station with the Synth. Different species, different uniforms, different words for the same equation. The math always came out the same way. The ambulatory wounded can maintain pace, Veshkari said carefully. The 2 critical casualties would slow our withdrawal to 1.8 kilometers per hour. At that pace, the Kethren forward elements would overtake us within 9 kilometers, well inside the corridor. So you leave them. Veshkari didn't answer immediately. The harmonic from his thorax deepened, and his mandibles locked in the position Morrow had come to recognize as decision made but not spoken. Among the Draivek, the wounded who could not march were left with a sidearm and a communications beacon. It wasn't cruelty. It was arithmetic. Their doctrine was built on it, 1,200 years of colonial warfare on worlds where extraction was a luxury and speed was survival. Leave the slow. Save the formation. The formation is the species. It was clean doctrine. Morrow understood it. He even respected the logic. He just didn't follow it. Sergeant Morrow, Veshkari said, and his voice was careful now, diplomatic in the way that meant he expected disagreement and was attempting to frame it in terms that wouldn't damage the coalition relationship. Coalition doctrine does not override Draivek field protocols within a Draivek theater of operations. The critical casualties will be given. I'm not arguing doctrine, Morrow said. I'm telling you what my team is going to do. He turned and walked toward the medical tent. Hollies had the two critical casualties laid out on collapsible litters when Morrow arrived. One was a Draivek private with a shattered thoracic plate and shrapnel embedded in the hemolymph reservoir on his left side, the equivalent of a chest wound in a human, but worse because the Draivek circulatory system didn't clot the way mammalian blood did. It seeped. The hemolymph was a thin, amber fluid that wickered through bandages and spread in slow, dark stains across whatever surface it touched. The field dressings Ewan had applied were already soaked. The other was a Draivek corporal, with both lower limbs crushed below the mid-joint. She was conscious, her compound eyes tracking Morrow as he entered, her mandibles locked tight in what he recognized as pain suppression, a rhythmic, barely audible clicking that functioned like gritting teeth. Her name tag read THEVARI in Draivek script, with the Coalition Standard transliteration stamped below. Private First Class Ewan was working on the chest wound. Tech Sergeant Alvara was splinting the crushed limbs. Both of them looked up when Morrow ducked under the tent flap. "Relay's gone," Morrow said. "No comms, no extraction, no air support. Kethren forward elements are 3 hours out. The Draivek are going to march south. We're going with them." Ewan's hands didn't stop working. He was 24, lean, from a mountain town in Gansu province, and he had the kind of hands that did things while the rest of him was thinking about other things. Right now, his hands were repacking a hemolymph reservoir with hemostatic compound, while his eyes asked the question before his mouth did. "And these two? They're coming with us." Hollies appeared at the tent entrance behind him. She'd heard. She always heard 11 years of working around detonations had, paradoxically, made her hearing sharper, not duller, because she'd learned to listen for the sounds that mattered and filter out the ones that didn't. 3 words from Morrow always mattered. "The Draivek are leaving them," Holly said, not a question. "Yes. And we're not." "No." Hollies looked at the 2 casualties, then at Morrow, then at the shaped charges still clipped to her vest. Her expression didn't change. 22 years of making and unmaking things had given her a face that processed information like a circuit board: input received, options evaluated, output selected. No drama, no hesitation, just the quiet reconfiguration of a professional adjusting to new parameters. "We'll need drag litters," she said. "The collapsible ones won't hold on broken ground. Mining rail from the eastern barricade, I can bend the runners on site, use tactical webbing for the bed, and rig harness systems that distribute weight across the shoulders and hips. 30 minutes. You have 20. Hollies nodded and left. Morrow heard her boots on the packed earth, then the sound of a cutting torch, then the screech of mining rail being separated from the barricade framework. She was already working. Alvara looked up from the splint. Tech Sergeant Carmen Alvara was the team's explosives specialist, a quiet, methodical woman from Durango who had spent her career turning infrastructure into craters and felt about it the way a surgeon felt about amputation. Necessary, precise, and nothing to celebrate. She wore her hair short and her opinions shorter. "How many charges do we have left?" Morrow asked her. Alvara's inventory was in her head, same as always. 14 shaped, 6 directional, 2 cratering charges. Plus whatever Hollies hasn't assigned. Enough to close the corridor behind us. Alvara paused, her hand still on the Vari's shattered limb. She looked toward the tent entrance, where the canyon walls were visible in the morning light, 200 meters of fractured basalt rising on either side of the dry riverbed that formed the corridor's floor. Wind-carved, layered. She studied them the way she studied everything, as structures with fracture planes, load tolerances, and failure points. "Not close it," she said. "The corridor is too wide to seal with what we've got, but I can make it expensive. The narrows at kilometer 4, the walls pinch to about 40 meters. I can bring down enough rock to block vehicles and force infantry to climb. That's the first choke. There's another set of narrows at kilometer 8. 2 charges there, same result. How much time does that buy? Depends on their engineers. 20 minutes per choke point minimum. Could be an hour if the rockfall is heavy enough. Do it. Alvara nodded. She finished the splint with 3 efficient motions, secured it with tape and stood. She picked up her demolition kit, a heavy, olive-drab pack that clinked with the muffled sound of shaped charges packed in foam, and walked out of the tent without another word. Morrow watched her go, then he looked down at Corporal Devari. Her compound eyes were fixed on his face. The pain suppression clicking had stopped. In its place was silence, the same silence Veshkari had shown. The register that meant the Draivek mind had moved past its existing categories and was processing something it had no framework for. "You're coming with us, Corporal," Morrow said. "That's not a request." She stared at him for 4 more seconds. Then the clicking resumed, but different now. Slower. A pattern he hadn't heard from a Draivek before. Outside the tent, the outpost was being dismantled in the efficient, unsentimental way that military positions are dismantled when there's no intention of returning. Draivek soldiers stripped the sentry positions of their targeting modules, components too valuable to leave for the Kethren, and collapsed the perimeter sensors into their carry cases. The automated turrets were set to independent targeting mode, powered by their own fuel cells, aimed north. They would fire on anything that crossed the perimeter until their ammunition ran out, which would be approximately 14 minutes after the Kethren arrived. 14 minutes of noise and confusion that would cost the Kethren nothing except time, and time was the only currency Morrow was trading in. He walked the perimeter while Hollies built the litters. The morning sun was climbing fast, and the canyon walls threw long, sharp shadows across the riverbed that shortened as he watched. In 3 hours, there would be no shadows. The corridor would be a slot of bright, exposed stone with nowhere to hide and nowhere to run except south. At the western wall, a Draivek sergeant was organizing his squad for the march. Morrow had seen this process a dozen times, the quick, clicking exchange of march orders, the synchronized shoulder plate adjustments that brought their chitin into travel configuration, the inventory of water and ammunition conducted in the rhythmic shorthand that was as close to unconscious behavior as the Draivek got. What he hadn't seen before was the way the sergeant's compound eyes kept drifting toward the medical tent, toward the 2 casualties inside. The sergeant saw Morrow watching. His mandibles clicked once, a sound that the translation membrane rendered as nothing because it fell outside the classified speech range. But Morrow had been on planet long enough to recognize it. It was the Draivek equivalent of a tight nod between soldiers who disagreed about something important and respected each other enough not to argue about it. Morrow nodded back, the human version, no translation needed. At the supply tent, he filled his canteen from the last water bladder and stuffed his cargo pockets with ration packs, small, dense blocks of compressed nutrients that tasted like compressed nutrients and sustained a human body for approximately 6 hours of sustained exertion, which was marketing optimism but better than nothing. He took 8. 4 for him, 4 to distribute. He didn't take more because there wasn't more. Then he walked back to the medical tent, picked up the harness Hollies had just finished rigging, and felt its weight settle on his shoulders. They moved out at 6:48. The column was 47 bodies, 39 Draivek infantry, 4 humans, 2 Draivek casualties on litters, and Lieutenant Veshkari at the head. First platoon took point. Third platoon took rear guard. The humans with their litters fell into the center of the formation, and the column moved south into the Tesavari corridor at the pace of the slowest element. That pace was Morrow and Ewan, pulling dead weight across a dry riverbed of loose stone and fractured basalt. Hollies' litter design was brutal and simple, the kind of engineering that came from a species that had been dragging its wounded out of bad terrain since before it had discovered metal. Mining rail runners, bent at the forward tips to prevent digging. Tactical webbing stretched taut across the frame. A harness system with chest and hip straps that distributed the load so the legs did the work rather than the back. It was well designed. It was also 60 kilograms of Draivek casualty, plus litter weight plus the friction coefficient of steel on fractured stone, and no amount of design made that light. The first kilometer took 18 minutes. Morrow's shoulders burned by the end of it. The harness dug into the muscle above his collarbones and turned each step into a negotiation between forward motion and the ground's insistence that everything should stay exactly where it was. His boots found traction, slipped on loose stone, found it again. Sweat ran into his eyes inside 5 minutes. He wiped it with his forearm and kept pulling. Beside him, Ewan was doing the same with Private Kethren, the chest wound casualty. The young medic was lighter than Morrow by 15 kilograms but had the dense, wiry endurance of someone who'd grown up hauling supplies through mountain villages at altitude. His face was blank. His hands were on the harness straps. His feet kept moving. Every 300 meters, he checked the hemolymph dressings without stopping a glance over his shoulder, a quick assessment, a micro-adjustment to the compression bandage, and then forward again. Behind them, Alvara had stayed at the outpost. Morrow didn't look back. Looking back was a luxury he couldn't afford, because looking back meant thinking about what Alvara was doing right now alone in an evacuated outpost, wiring charges to the canyon walls at the Narrows, setting detonators to pressure triggers and tripwires and buried command lines, turning 40 meters of stone corridor into the most expensive piece of real estate on the planet. She was methodical. She was patient. And she was alone behind them, with enough explosive to rearrange the local geography. At the 2-kilometer mark, the first Kethren shells began falling behind them. The shells were ranging shots imprecise, landing on the ridgeline above the corridor rather than in it. The Kethren were firing blind, using grid coordinates from their orbital survey rather than direct observation. Each impact sent a plume of red dust and shattered stone into the morning air, and the sound rolled down the canyon walls like drumbeats made of gravel. One, then another, then a third, walking south along the ridge in 50-meter increments. The Draivek infantry flinched at the first impact. Not badly, they were trained soldiers, and their chitin plates locked involuntarily into a defensive configuration that hunched their shoulders and narrowed their profiles, a reflex hardwired by evolution for exactly this kind of threat. But their pace faltered. The synchronized clicking of their march rhythm stuttered, and for 3 seconds the column drifted. Morrow kept pulling. Corporal Dhavari, on the litter behind him, made a sound. Low, clicking, something the translation membrane didn't catch because it was below the threshold of what the membrane classified as speech. He glanced back and saw her compound eyes fixed on the smoke rising behind them, on the ridgeline they'd left, on the place where her doctrine said she should have been left with a sidearm and a beacon. "Face forward," Morrow said. His voice was flat, conversational, pitched the same way he'd pitch it if he were telling someone the coffee was ready. "Watch the canyon walls. Tell me if anything moves." She didn't respond for a moment. Then her compound eyes rotated forward, and she began scanning the walls with the systematic precision of a trained soldier given a task, a purpose, something to do besides being carried. At the 3-kilometer mark, Veshkari dropped back from the head of the column. The Draivek lieutenant moved with the stiff, controlled gait of an officer managing conflicting priorities, his compound eyes alternating between the northern ridgeline, the column spacing, and the 2 humans hauling litters at the formation center. He fell into step beside Morrow without speaking for 30 meters. Then, "Your team's pace is slowing the column by 18%. "I know. At our current rate, the Kethren forward elements will establish visual contact within 4 hours. They have armored reconnaissance vehicles. We do not." "I know that too. If you release the litters, The column could increase to standard march pace. We would reach the relay in 8 hours instead of 11. Morrow didn't look at him. His eyes were on the ground, the next stone, the next foothold, the next meter of fractured basalt. The harness creaked against his shoulders. Sweat ran down the sides of his neck and soaked into the collar of his jacket. "Lieutenant," he said, and his voice hadn't changed at all, "those are your soldiers on these litters." Veshkari's mandibles locked. The thoracic harmonic returned that low, sustained register that Morrow kept hearing and still couldn't fully translate. Something between acknowledgement and confusion, like a navigation system recalculating after the road it expected simply wasn't there. "They are in our doctrine. Your doctrine says leave them. Mine says I'm pulling this litter to that relay. Those two things can coexist. They just can't agree." 4 seconds of silence. Then Veshkari moved back to the head of the column without another word. At the 4-kilometer mark, they heard the first detonation from the Narrows. It was big. Alvara had used a cratering charge. The sound hit the canyon like a physical wall, a deep, concussive boom that flattened the scrub brush and sent a shockwave of dust racing south along the riverbed. Birds, or whatever the local equivalent was, something with membranous wings and too many joints, launched from the canyon walls in a scattered, chittering cloud. The Draivek soldiers dropped into defensive positions instinctively, chitin plates flaring, weapons up. The column stopped. Morrow didn't stop. He shifted his harness, found his footing, and kept dragging. "That's Alvara," he said to Veshkari, who had moved back along the column to the center. "She just closed the first Narrows." One charge. Veshkari's compound eyes were fixed on the dust cloud rising above the canyon walls behind them. "What does that buy?" "Depends on how much rock she brought down. Could be 10 minutes, could be 30. And then she uses the next one." The second detonation came 9 minutes later. Smaller, a shaped charge, precise, placed to shear a vertical section of canyon wall across the riverbed like a door slamming shut. The rubble would force the Kethren to climb or bring forward engineering vehicles to clear the debris. Either option cost time. Morrow pulled. The harness carved its familiar grooves into his shoulders. The sun climbed. At the 5-kilometer mark, the Kethren probed. It wasn't a full assault. It was a reconnaissance by fire. 4 or 5 Kethren scouts who had slipped through the rubble of the first Narrows on foot, faster than the main column, and were now pushing south to reacquire visual contact with the retreating garrison. They came along the eastern ridge, moving low and fast, their sulphurous bioluminescent eyes flickering between scans. One of them fired a ranging burst from a plasma carbine down into the corridor, not at the column, but ahead of it, the bolt searing a black streak across the basalt floor and sending a geyser of molten stone spraying 20 meters. It was a message, "We see you." 3rd Platoon's rear guard responded before Veshkari could issue an order. The Draivek soldiers at the column's tail dropped behind the corridor's natural stone shelves and returned fire in a coordinated pattern that was so precisely timed it sounded like a single weapon firing from 5 positions at once. Plasma bolts cracked upward toward the ridge, chipping stone, forcing the scouts to pull back from the rim. The exchange lasted 40 seconds. No casualties on either side. But 40 seconds was 40 seconds of the column not moving, and Morrow used those seconds to assess something he'd been watching since the march began. The Draivek soldiers were looking at the litters. Not the way they'd looked at the start, the quick, clinical glance of soldiers cataloging a deviation from doctrine and moving on. This was different. They were watching the harness straps bite into the human shoulders. They were watching Ewan's blistered hands grip the webbing without loosening. They were watching the mining rail runners leave their parallel scars in the stone floor, kilometer after kilometer, a continuous record of effort that their doctrine said was irrational and their eyes said was happening anyway. A Draivek sergeant from 1st Platoon, Morrow had heard the others call him Kethren, moved to the rear of the column after the scouts were driven back. He didn't speak to Morrow. Instead, he positioned his fire team at the column's tail, directly behind the litters, and began walking backward, facing north, covering the withdrawal, putting his body between the Kethren scouts and the two casualties his doctrine said should have been left behind. Morrow didn't comment on it, he pulled. At the 5.5-kilometer mark, the Vari clicked sharply from the litter. Movement, she said, and the translation membrane gave the word a flat metallic edge that didn't convey the urgency of the clicks underneath. Eastern wall. Lo, 2 figures, not Kethren. Morrow looked. It took him 3 seconds to find them, 2 shapes pressed against the canyon wall, in a depression that would have been invisible from the column's line of march. They were small, gray-brown, wearing what looked like torn civilian garments. Not Kethren scouts, not Draivek, something else. Tesavari, Veshkari said, appearing beside the litter. His compound eyes had already locked onto the depression. Local population. These were not evacuated. They were missed. Or they refused to leave. Some of the Highland clans do not recognize Draivek evacuation authority. They hide instead. Veshkari's mandibles clicked in a pattern Morrow read as frustration layered on concern. They are directly in the Kethren advance corridor. Morrow didn't slow down. The harness kept moving. The stone kept scraping. But he looked at the 2 figures in the depression huddled, still, watching the column pass with the wide-eyed silence of civilians caught between armies. And he made a calculation that took approximately half a second. Tell them to fall in with the column, center formation, between the platoons. Veshkari hesitated. They are not combatants, they are not coalition personnel, our orders. Your orders say hold and evacuate. We're evacuating, they're coming. Veshkari issued a series of rapid clicks toward the depression. The 2 Tesavari emerged a pair of elderly locals, bipedal, short, with rough brown hide and 4-fingered hands gripping bundle-wrapped possessions. They moved into the column's center without a word, falling into step behind the litters with the particular silence of people who understood that the protection being offered was not guaranteed, and that silence was the least they could offer in return. 49 bodies now. The math kept changing, the pace didn't. At the 6-kilometer mark, Hollis dropped back from the center of the column and fell into step beside him. She was carrying her own kit, 30 kilograms of demolition equipment, tools and ammunition, and she was breathing hard but steady, the deep rhythmic breathing of someone managing a sustained effort rather than fighting it. Her face was flushed dark red from the heat and the dust, and her hands were raw where the straps of her pack had rubbed through her gloves. She wasn't slowing. She'd matched his pace for 6 kilometers, which meant she'd been doing math in her head, and she had results. Alvarez bought us distance, she said, but the Kethren are going to push through. Those charges slow them down, they don't stop them. They've got engineers too, not as good as ours, but good enough. I know. When they clear both narrows, they'll be on us inside 2 hours. Our pace isn't going to be enough. I know that too. Hollis looked at the litter, at Corporal Vari strapped to it, at the hemolymph that had seeped through the bandages on the Draivek soldiers' crushed limbs and dried to a dark amber crust on the mining rail runners. Then she looked at Morrow with the expression of someone who had already solved the problem and was waiting for permission to implement the solution. I can set a second line, she said. The canyon narrows again at the 8-kilometer mark. Good rock. Sedimentary layers over basalt, clean fracture plains. I can bring down enough to force them to dismount their vehicles and clear by hand. That buys us another 30 to 45 minutes. That puts you alone behind us. That puts me where I'm useful, Sarge. Morrow kept pulling. The harness bit into the same raw spots it had been working for 6 kilometers, and the pain had moved from acute to ambient, a constant background signal that his body had stopped reporting as an emergency and started treating as operating conditions. The dust was thick now, kicked up by the column ahead, and it coated his face and filled the creases of his neck and ears. His water was half gone. The Verasi-3 sun was climbing toward its noon position, and the canyon walls were turning the corridor into an oven, the basalt absorbing heat and radiating it inward until the air at the riverbed floor shimmered. "Do it," he said. Hollis peeled off the column without another word. She moved north, back up the corridor, toward the 8-kilometer narrows, alone, carrying enough explosives to rearrange the local architecture. She didn't look back. Morrow watched her go for 1 second, then he faced forward and pulled. At the 7-kilometer mark, Morrow's right boot split at the sole. The fracture ran across the ball of the foot, where the constant flexion of pulling against the harness had been working the material for 5 hours straight. The basalt was abrasive, a surface engineered by volcanism to be as hostile to manufactured materials as the planet's classification suggested. He felt the split as a sudden change in traction, a looseness where there had been grip, and then the sharp bite of stone against the bare skin underneath. He didn't stop. He adjusted his stride to put more weight on the heel, where the sole was still intact, and kept pulling. The adjustment changed the mechanics of each step less efficient, more strain on the calf, a cascade of compensations running up his right leg. His body computed the adjustment and implemented it without consulting him. This was what bodies did. They solved problems the mind didn't have time to articulate, because the mind was busy with larger things, like the distance remaining and the column behind, and the sound of Kethren engines grinding through rubble 8 kilometers north. At the 7.5-kilometer mark, Ewan's voice came from beside him, low and factual. "Your foot is bleeding." "I know. You're leaving a blood trail." "Then the Kethren will know which way we went. Save them the trouble of scouting." Ewan didn't smile. Neither did Morrow. It wasn't a joke. It was the kind of thing men said to each other when the alternative was silence, and silence was too close to thinking, and thinking was too close to the math that said this march was already past the margin of the possible. Between the 7 and 8-kilometer marks, the column's character changed in ways that no after-action report would capture because they happened below the threshold of official notice. The Draivek soldiers began distributing their water. They did it without orders, without protocol, without the clicking exchanges that preceded every other collective Draivek action. Individual soldiers, one at a time, detached their canteens and passed them forward to the column's center, where the 4 humans were pulling litters. The canteens arrived via the Draivek equivalent of a bucket brigade chitin-plated hands, passing aluminum vessels from one soldier to the next with the mechanical efficiency of an assembly line that had decided, collectively and without discussion, to redirect its resources. Morrow didn't notice the first canteen until it appeared on the litter beside the Vari. She clicked once, the soft, short click that he'd learned to interpret as attention, and he looked down and saw it. Full. The condensation on its surface catching the noon light. He drank. The water was warm and tasted faintly of minerals and the Draivek hemolymph analog that lined the canteen's interior, and it was the best thing he'd tasted since 600. A second canteen arrived for Ewan. A third was passed to the 2 Tessavari civilians, who accepted it with the careful, wordless gratitude of people who understood what the gesture cost and what it meant. Morrow looked back along the column. The Draivek soldiers who had given their water were marching without complaint, their mandibles clicking in the slow, measured rhythm of sustained effort. They would be thirsty before the relay. Some of them would need medical attention for dehydration, because Draivek physiology was less tolerant of fluid loss than human physiology, and every canteen given was a deficit that couldn't be recovered on the march. They had given them anyway. At the 8-kilometer mark, a muffled boom rolled down the canyon from the north. Then another, sharper, closer. Hollis's charges at the second narrows. The sound was followed by the slow, grinding roar of collapsing stone, a sustained avalanche that echoed between the canyon walls for 15 full seconds before settling into the particular silence of a landscape that had just been rearranged. Morrow keyed his tactical. Holly's report. Static 3 seconds, 5. West wall is down, full collapse across the corridor floor. They're going to need a week and a crane. A pause. Then, with the professional satisfaction of a demolitions expert admiring her own architecture, good rock, clean fracture, textbook. Move south, catch the column. Already moving. At the 9-kilometer mark, Ewan called a halt. Private Cathari's chest wound was bleeding again. The hemolymph seepage from the shrapnel had soaked through the field dressings and was dripping off the litter in a slow, steady patter that left dark spots on the pale stone of the riverbed. Ewan knelt beside the litter, cut away the outer dressing with a blade he'd sterilized 3 times that morning, and repacked the wound with the last of his hemostatic compound, a human-manufactured coagulant that had been reformulated for Draivek hemolymph chemistry during the first year of the coalition integration. The formula wasn't perfect. It slowed the seeping rather than stopping it, but slowed was enough. Slowed was alive. While Ewan worked, Morrow unstrapped his harness and straightened. His shoulders had stopped burning an hour ago. They had entered a state he recognized from long-haul carries, entraining a deep, mechanical numbness that would become pain again the moment he stopped using the muscles, and would become a problem approximately 12 hours after that. He didn't think about 12 hours from now. He thought about the next 100 meters. He drank water, he checked his sidearm, he looked north. The smoke from Alvara's demolitions was visible above the canyon walls, 2 distinct columns, one from each narrows she'd collapsed. Between them, barely audible over the wind, he could hear the grinding sound of Kethren engines working through rubble. They were clearing the choke points. Alvara had slowed them, but she hadn't stopped them. He keyed his short-range tactical. Alvara. Status. 3 seconds of static. Then, both narrows blocked. First one is holding, they're working it with a breaching vehicle. I'm moving south now. I'll catch the column in 40 minutes. Any contact? Negative direct, but they've got scouts on the eastern ridge. Yellow Eyes moving fast. Yellow Eyes. That was the team's shorthand for Kethren light infantry, the Dominion scout warrior caste, smaller and faster than the mainline troops, with bioluminescent ocular membranes that glowed a deep sulfurous gold. They moved low, they moved quiet, and they carried targeting relays that could feed coordinates to the mortar teams behind them. One scout on a ridgeline could turn a corridor into a kill zone. How many? Morrow asked. Hard to tell from down here, at least 8. Maybe a full section. They're not engaging, just watching. Targeting data. That's my read. Can you get clear? A pause. The kind of pause that meant Alvara was evaluating terrain, calculating distance, and deciding how much truth to share. I'll manage. Alvara out. Morrow put the handset down and looked at Veshkari, who had been listening. The Draivek lieutenant's compound eyes were fixed on the eastern ridge, and his mandibles were moving in a rapid, complex pattern that the translation membrane wasn't catching subvocal communication with his platoon leaders, issuing orders in the Draivek combat register that was too fast and too layered for the membrane to parse. The scouts will reach the ridge above our current position within the hour, Veshkari said. When they do, they will have direct observation of the column. The ranging shots will become aimed fire. I know. At that point, the corridor becomes a kill zone. We will be bracketed. The formation will break. Morrow looked south. The corridor stretched ahead for another 32 kilometers, a long gauntlet of basalt walls and dry riverbed with no cover that mattered. Somewhere ahead, there was a coalition relay, an extraction point, a frequency that would bring dropships and air support. But that was 32 kilometers away, and the Kethren were behind them, above them, and closing. Then we need to get off the corridor floor, Morrow said. Veshkari's mandibles stopped. Off the floor. The western ridge. There's a lateral drainage channel about 2 kilometers ahead. I saw it on the terrain survey maps when we set up the relay. It cuts west through the ridge wall, climbs about 100 meters and opens onto a plateau. If we can get the column up that channel, we're off the corridor axis. The scouts lose line of sight. The artillery loses its fire template. That channel was assessed during the initial survey. It is not rated for troop movement. The gradient exceeds Draivek's standard traverse capability. The angle is approximately 35 degrees for the first 60 meters, with loose scree and unstable lateral support. I know what the survey says. Your people can climb it. It'll hurt. It'll be slow. You'll need to lock your thoracic plates in high friction mode and use your upper limbs for stabilization. But you can climb it. Veshkari stared at him. The low harmonic from his thorax was back, the sustained register that Morrow had been hearing all day and still couldn't translate. You have memorized our terrain survey. I read it on the transport in. It's what engineers do. 4 seconds of silence. Then Veshkari turned and began clicking orders to his platoon leaders. The column shifted west. The drainage channel was everything the survey said it was, and nothing the survey could prepare a body for. Steep, narrow, choked with loose scree and fractured stone. The angle was brutal, 35 degrees for the first 60 meters, steep enough that standing upright felt like leaning into a wall. The Draivek soldiers struggled with it. Their segmented limbs were engineered by evolution for flat ground efficiency, for the synchronized clicking march that covered distance on level terrain like a machine covering belt. The loose stone shifted under their clawed feet in ways that sent soldiers sliding backward in a clatter of chitin, scattering scree down the slope. Morrow pulled the litter up the channel. There was no trick to it, no engineering solution, no clever workaround. He crouched low, set his feet against the largest stable stones he could find, grabbed the harness with both hands and hauled. Each step was a negotiation with gravity. Lean forward, push with the legs, slide the runners 6 inches up the slope, reset, find the next foothold, do it again. His world compressed to the space between his boots and the next stone. His shoulders were beyond numbness now. They had entered a state of pure mechanical function, the muscles firing because they were receiving signals and did not know how to do anything else. Ewan was behind him, doing the same. The young medic had stopped talking 20 minutes ago. He had stopped making any sound at all except the rhythmic grunt of exertion that came with each pull, and the scrape of mining rail runners on stone, and the occasional soft word to Kethren, checking pulse, checking dressings, checking the things a medic checks when he can't stop moving but also can't stop caring. Halfway up, Corporal Devari spoke. "Why?" she said. The translation membrane turned it into a flat, uninflected word, but the clicks underneath had a pattern Morrow recognized. It wasn't "why are you doing this?" which was a human question that presupposed emotional motivation. It was "why does your body continue to function under these conditions?" which was a Draivek question that presupposed engineering limits. "Because it does," Morrow said. He pulled. The stone shifted under his left boot and he dropped to one knee, the litter's weight yanking his shoulders backward. For 1 second, he and 60 kilograms of Draivek corporal hung in the balance between up and down. His fingers locked on the harness straps. The tendons in his forearms stood out like cables. He found the foothold again, set his jaw and drove upward. The Draivek soldiers around him had stopped climbing. They were watching. Morrow could feel their compound eyes on him the way you feel sunlight, not individual gazes but a collective heat, dozens of amber facets reflecting the same improbable thing. A soft-skinned mammal, roughly their height, pulling one of their wounded up a grade their own doctrine classified as impassable and refusing to stop. He didn't notice. He was looking at the next stone. Then something changed. A Draivek private from 1st Platoon, young, compact, with chitin plates the color of dark copper, stepped out of the climbing line and moved toward Morrow's litter. Without speaking, Without any gesture or protocol that Morrow recognized, the soldier crouched beside the litter, gripped the frame with two of his four upper limbs and pulled. The litter moved, not much more easily, but the load split in two and the next 6 inches of slope cost half the effort. Another Draivek joined, then a third. The litter became a team effort, a human and 3 chitin-plated soldiers hauling 60 kilograms of their own wounded up a slope their doctrine said couldn't be climbed. No one spoke. No one gave an order. The translation membranes were silent because this wasn't language. Vishkari, at the top of the channel, watched. At the top of the channel, the plateau opened up a broad, flat expanse of wind-scoured basalt under the noon sun. No cover, but no canyon walls to pin them either. The Kethren scouts on the eastern ridge would lose visual contact the moment the column cleared the western rim. The artillery would have to recompute for the new elevation, and by the time it did, the column would be moving south across terrain that had no fire template. Morrow crested the rim and collapsed forward onto his hands and knees. He stayed there for 12 seconds, breathing against the ground, feeling his heart hammer. Then he stood, turned around, and helped Ewan pull the second litter over the edge. Veshkari appeared beside him. The officer's chitin was scratched and dusty, cracked in 2 places along the dorsal ridge where the channel walls had abraded his plates. His compound eyes were fixed on Morrow's shoulders, where the harness straps had cut through his jacket and into the skin, leaving 2 parallel lines of dark red that ran from collarbone to shoulder blade. "You are injured." "I'm chafed, different thing. Your species does not distinguish between tissue damage and discomfort. My species distinguishes between things that stop you and things that don't." Morrow adjusted his harness. The blood had glued the straps to his skin, and separating them was a small private event that he processed without expression. "Which way is south?" Veshkari pointed. The plateau ran south-southwest for at least 6 kilometers before it descended back toward lower ground. Flat, open, fast ground. Ground they could cover in 90 minutes if the column pushed. "Move," Morrow said, "before they reacquire us." The plateau was the first kind ground they'd walked since leaving the outpost, and the column moved across it with the desperate efficiency of people who understood that kindness in terrain was always temporary. Morrow's harness still cut into his shoulders, but the flat stone surface let the litter runners glide rather than scrape, and the difference in effort was enough to let him lift his head and look at the people he was marching with. The column had changed shape. It had started the morning as a formation Draivek doctrine, clean spacing, 3 platoons in a textbook withdrawal configuration with the casualties segregated in the center like cargo being routed through a logistics chain. 11 hours later, it was something else. The platoon boundaries had blurred. Draivek soldiers from different units had drifted toward the center, closing around the litters and the 2 Tesavari civilians in a tighter ring than any doctrine prescribed. The rear guard was still maintaining interval, still professional, still watching north, but the rest of the column had quietly reorganized itself around the thing in its center that it wasn't willing to lose. Nobody had ordered that. It had happened the way weather happens, 1 particle at a time, below the threshold of policy, until the pattern was visible only from above. At the 2-kilometer mark on the plateau, a Draivek soldier from 2nd Platoon collapsed. Not from wounds, from heat. The soldier's chitin had gone from dark charcoal to a pale, chalky gray, the Draivek equivalent of a fever flush, indicating that the internal temperature regulation system had reached its operating ceiling and begun shedding function to preserve core organs. The soldier dropped mid-stride, his legs folding under him with the mechanical collapse of a load-bearing structure that had exceeded its tolerance, and he hit the basalt with a sound like ceramic striking stone. 2 Draivek soldiers moved to help him. They got him upright, got his arms across their shoulders, and began walking. Their pace didn't change. Their march rhythm absorbed him the way a river absorbs a stone, flowing around the obstruction, adjusting, continuing. Morrow watched it happen. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The Draivek were doing what he'd been doing since 648, and they were doing it for the same reason. And the reason didn't need to be said in any language because it predated language by 100 million years of evolution on 100 different worlds. You carried your people. You carried them because you could, and because they couldn't, and because the alternative was a thing you refused to compute. At the 3-kilometer mark, the Vari spotted the scouts before anyone else did. "Ridge," she said, "one click sharp, military." The compound eyes that had been scanning the eastern horizon for 7 hours locked onto a point that Morrow couldn't yet see, and her upper limbs, the ones that still worked, gestured with the precise, abbreviated shorthand of a trained spotter calling a contact. Veshkari reacted first, relaying the contact to 1st Platoon's lead element. The column adjusted, spreading wider, lowering profiles, increasing the gap between soldiers to reduce the mortar footprint. All of it triggered by a soldier on a litter who should have been left behind with a sidearm and a beacon, and who had instead spent 11 hours turning herself into the column's early warning system, because a human combat engineer had given her a job to do instead of a death to wait for. They covered 4 kilometers on the plateau before the Kethren scouts found them again. The first sign was a flicker of sulfurous gold on the canyon rim to the east, a bioluminescent eye flash from a Kethren scout who had climbed the eastern ridge and was scanning the plateau with a long-range observation relay. Morrow saw it. Veshkari saw it. Every Draivek soldier in the column saw it, because their compound eyes were tuned by evolution to detect exactly that frequency of bioluminescent light. The column kept moving. There was nothing else to do. The second sign was the mortar round that landed 60 meters ahead of the lead element. The blast threw stone and dust into the air in a flat, spreading cone that lit the noon sky with red particulate. The Draivek soldiers scattered laterally trained reflex textbook dispersal pattern. Morrow dropped beside his litter and covered the Vari's body with his own. The stone fragments peppered his back like a handful of gravel thrown hard. He felt 2 of them bite through his jacket and lodge in the muscle beneath his left shoulder blade, shallow, hot, and immediately present. Not deep enough to matter, deep enough to know. He got up. Blood ran down his back, warm and then cold in the wind. He picked up the harness. "Sergeant," Veshkari said from 6 meters to his left. The Draivek officer was prone behind a basalt shelf, sidearm drawn. "They have our position. They will bring fire on the descent route. Then we don't descend. There is no other route south from this plateau. There is if we make one." Morrow pulled the litter toward a low depression in the plateau's surface, a natural drainage basin where seasonal runoff had carved a shallow channel into the basalt. Not deep enough for real cover, deep enough to break line of sight from the eastern ridge if they stayed low. "Get your people into the drainage," he called to Veshkari. "Single file, heads below the rim, move fast." The Draivek complied. The order was tactically sound, regardless of who issued it. Within 4 minutes, the column was strung out along the drainage channel, moving south at a crouch, the basalt rim providing concealment. Another mortar round landed. Further back, the Kethren were correcting, walking fire south, but the drainage channel was narrow and the rounds were overshooting. Each explosion sent stone into the air and filled the channel with choking dust. The column kept moving. Between the 15 and 17-kilometer marks, the column endured what soldiers endure when artillery is hunting them, and the only response is motion. The mortar rounds came in irregular intervals, not the steady, rhythmic bombardment of a fire support plan, but the hunting pattern of a team that had to relocate between shots and was estimating range from scout reports that arrived slower than the column moved. Each round was a guess, and each guess was getting closer, and the column absorbed each near miss the way a body absorbs a fever through accumulated stress that expressed itself in trembling hands and tunnel vision, and the slow erosion of everything that wasn't essential. Morrow kept pulling. The drainage channel forced him into a crouch, which changed the physics of the harness. The load transferred from his shoulders to his lower back, a redistribution that bought his shoulder muscles time at the expense of the lumbar region. He would pay for that trade later. The concept of later had become a foreign country. At the 16-kilometer mark, the Vari clicked sharply. Movement, Western Ridge, 4 shapes, not Kethren. Morrow looked. 4 more Tessavari civilians, these ones younger, a family group with 2 children clinging to the adults. They were crouched behind a basalt outcrop on the drainage channel's western rim, watching the column pass with the particular stillness of people who have learned that stillness is the first and last defense. Without breaking stride, Morrow jerked his head toward the column's center. The Tessavari understood the gesture. They slid down the channel wall and joined the formation, the children wedged between 2 Draivek soldiers whose chitin plates formed a corridor of armor around them. The soldiers didn't look down. They adjusted their spacing by centimeters and kept walking. 53 bodies now. At the 17-kilometer mark, a mortar round landed close enough to shower the column with stone debris. Ewan threw himself across Kethari's litter. The blast wave rocked the litter sideways and slammed Ewan's ribs against the mining rail runner. He made a sound, brief, sharp, involuntary, and then got up and kept pulling. His breathing had changed. Shallower, guarding the left side. Cracked rib, probably. Maybe 2. Enough to register as a problem, not enough to qualify as a reason. No one asked him if he was all right. No one needed to. The answer was evident in the fact that his hands were on the harness and his feet were moving. At the 18-kilometer mark, 2 things happened within 90 seconds of each other. The first, Holly's caught up. She came from the north at a dead run, a pace that should not have been sustainable for someone carrying 30 kilograms across broken terrain under fire. She slid into the drainage channel beside Morrow, breathing in deep, controlled pulls, her face caked in dust, her hands bloody where the rock had cut them. Second, Narrows collapsed, brought down the whole west wall. They'll need heavy equipment to clear it. What's behind you? Scouts. 6 confirmed on the ridge, probably more. They've got a light mortar team, man-portable tubes, relocating between shots. The second thing that happened, the mortar team found the drainage channel. The round landed 5 meters from the column's center. The blast killed 1 Draivek soldier, outright, a private from 3rd Platoon, who had been moving in a crouch, and caught the fragmentation across his unplatted thorax. He went down without sound. 3 more were wounded. The drainage channel's basalt walls channeled the blast energy and the fragmentation inward, turning cover into a shrapnel funnel. Morrow felt the concussion in his teeth. Stone dust filled his lungs and he coughed it out. The Vari's litter had been shielded by the channel wall, but the blast had shifted it 2 meters sideways. He grabbed the harness, pulled it back, checked her compound eyes tracking, mandibles clicking, alive. They've got the range, Holly said. She was already looking east, toward the ridge where the sulphurous eye flashes pulsed between mortar cycles. The distance was roughly 300 meters. Can you reach them? Holly's had 2 directional charges left. They were designed for breaching reinforced structures, focused shaped explosions that concentrated their energy in a single direction. At 100 meters, placed against the ridge wall and aimed upward, they could shear the face of the ridge onto whatever was behind it. If I can get within 100 meters of the ridgeline, yes, but it's open ground. Another round landed, further south, closer to the column's tail. A Draivek soldier screamed a high harmonic sound that cut through the explosion's echo. Hit, more wounded. The column was being disassembled, 1 shell at a time. Do it, Morrow said. Holly's climbed out of the drainage channel and ran east toward the ridge. She ran low, fast, her boots finding purchase on the basalt with the instinct of someone who had spent 2 decades reading rock surfaces. The mortar team didn't see her for the first 70 meters. She was moving perpendicular to their observation arc, below their scanning sweep. At 80 meters, a sulphurous eye flash tracked toward her and locked. The next round was aimed at her. It landed 12 meters to her right. She didn't stop. The blast rocked her sideways, shredded the right leg of her trousers, and peppered her flank with stone fragments. She kept running. 90 meters, 100. She reached the ridge wall, set the first directional charge against a fracture plane she could probably feel with her hands, armed it, and moved 10 meters south. Set the second, armed it, keyed the detonator. The eastern ridge erupted. The charges fired upward and inward, and the ridge wall cracked along its fracture planes with a sound like the world splitting a seam. A section roughly 8 meters wide and 4 meters tall sheared away from the face, and collapsed inward onto the scout position in a cascade of basalt and red dust that took the mortar team with it. The shelling stopped. For 4 minutes, the only sounds were boots on stone, the grinding of litter runners, and the distant settling of rock where the ridge had been. The column moved in the silence the way water moves through a break in a dam, finding the path, filling it, flowing. Then Hollies appeared on the drainage channel's eastern rim. She climbed down with the careful, deliberate movement of someone who had just done something requiring absolute precision, and was now allowing her body to acknowledge the cost. Her left arm was hanging wrong, dislocated shoulder, either from the blast concussion or the scramble back down. The right side of her body was bleeding from a dozen stone cuts, and she was favoring her left ankle. "Mortar team's gone," she said. Her voice was steady. "Scouts too, the ones on that section." Morrow looked at the shoulder. "Can you move?" "Can you?" He didn't smile. The sun was directly overhead, pouring into the drainage channel like liquid brass. His shadow was a dark spot under his boots. The harness straps were bonded to his shoulders with dried blood. His back carried stone fragments like a bulletin board carries pins. His water was gone. They were at the 20-kilometer mark. 21 to go. "Yeah," he said, "I can move." The next 6 kilometers were the longest. Not because of the distance. Distance was a number. Numbers could be divided into steps, and steps could be counted, and counted things could be completed. The distance wasn't the problem. The problem was the column. It was coming apart. Not dramatically, not the sudden fragmentation of a unit under direct fire. This was slower. The Draivek soldiers were still marching, still maintaining formation, but their pace was deteriorating in a way that Morrow recognized from every forced march he'd ever made across hostile terrain. Heat was part of it. The Verasi 3 sun had pushed the surface temperature past 45 degrees, and the basalt plateau radiated it back like a griddle. The Draivek chitin was designed for temperature regulation, but regulation had limits. Their mandible clicking grew erratic. Their march rhythm stuttered and reformed and stuttered again. 2 soldiers from 2nd Platoon were being supported by their squadmates, not wounded, just used up. Their hemolymph efficiency was dropping, their joint actuators seizing in the heat, their bodies approaching the operational ceiling that their engineers, who were not engineers, had never expected to reach. And the humans were carrying them. Not metaphorically, literally. When the first Draivek soldier stumbled and couldn't get up, Ewan, who was still hauling Private Kethren on a litter with both hands blistered raw, stopped long enough to let the soldier lean on his shoulder. They walked together for 400 meters before the Draivek's chitin cooled enough for autonomous movement. When the second soldier dropped, Morrow shifted the Vari's harness to one shoulder and pulled the fallen soldier's arm across the other. He hauled both of them for 600 meters, until a Draivek corporal took the soldier back. The Draivek watched this happen. The watching had changed. In the first hours, the compound eyes tracking the humans had carried something Morrow read as assessment categorization, the filing of data into existing frameworks. Now the watching was different. The frameworks had been filed and discarded. What replaced them was something the Draivek language had no clean word for, though the thoracic harmonics tried. The deep, layered sound that had started with Veshkari was spreading through the column like a frequency through water soldiers picking it up one at a time, adding their resonance, building it into something structural. It vibrated in the stone under Morrow's boots and hummed against his ribs. He didn't understand it. He didn't need to. Understanding was a luxury. Forward was a necessity. At the 26-kilometer mark, Alvara caught the column. She emerged from the south. She'd looped wide around the plateau's western edge to avoid the ridgeline scouts, adding 4 kilometers to her route. Her charge racks were empty. Her sidearm was holstered. She was carrying nothing except her pack frame and her canteen, and she looked like someone who had spent 4 hours alone in a canyon with nothing but explosives and rock mechanics for company, which was exactly what she was. She saw Holly's shoulder. She set down her pack, gripped the arm, and reduced the dislocation with one sharp motion, and the calm efficiency of a woman who had been resetting dislocated joints in field conditions since her 3rd deployment. Holly's made one sound, short, controlled, cut off at the teeth. Then she picked up her pack with her other hand and kept walking. Alvara fell into the column beside Morrow. She looked at his shoulders, at the stone fragments in his back, at the harness straps carved into his skin. She didn't comment. She reached down, took one of the litter's harness straps in her right hand and pulled. They pulled together. The litter moved faster, not fast, but faster. At the 28-kilometer mark, Morrow distributed the ration packs. He had 4 left. He gave one to Ewan, who ate it without stopping, tearing the wrapper with his teeth and chewing the compressed block with the mechanical rhythm of a machine being refueled. He gave one to Holly's, who tucked it into her vest and said she'd eat it later. She wouldn't eat it later. She would give it to whoever needed it next, because that was who Holly's was, a woman who carried 30 kilograms of demolition equipment for 28 kilometers, and then gave her food away, not out of generosity, but out of the same calculation that drove everything she did. The person who needed the calories most was the person who would contribute the most to the column's survival. The last 2 ration packs went to the Tesavari family. The children, small, wide-eyed, their 4-fingered hands clutching the ration blocks like prizes, ate with the desperate efficiency of people who hadn't expected to eat again. Their parents watched them, then watched Morrow, and the look in their eyes was the same look he'd seen in every pair of civilian eyes on every planet where the fighting had reached the people who hadn't asked for it. Not gratitude. Not yet. The capacity for gratitude required a surplus of safety that they didn't yet have. What they had was the beginning of belief, the first fragile understanding that the column around them intended to bring them somewhere alive. Morrow turned back to the harness. His own stomach was empty. It had been empty since 700, and it would stay empty until the relay. He didn't think about it because hunger, like pain, was a signal that his body had stopped prioritizing. The hierarchy of need had been recalculated somewhere around kilometer 12, and everything below, keep pulling, had been moved to a queue that would process later. Alvara, pulling beside him, noticed the empty wrapper in his vest. She reached into her own pack, pulled out a half-empty canteen, and passed it to him without a word. He drank, passed it back. They pulled. Behind them, the Draivek Sergeant Kethren, the one who had placed his fire team between the litters and the Kethren, was walking with a new gait. Not the synchronized clicking march. Something looser, less efficient, more adaptive. His clawed feet were finding purchase on the stone the way the human's boots did, rolling heel to toe rather than striking flat. It was biomechanically wrong for a Draivek. It was slower and less energy efficient than their evolved stride. But it was stable on broken ground in a way the standard march wasn't, and Kethren had learned it by watching Morrow walk for 28 kilometers. He wasn't the only one. 3 more Draivek soldiers had adopted the same gait. They moved awkwardly, their chitin plates grinding against the unfamiliar joint angles, but they moved steadily, and on this terrain, steadiness mattered more than efficiency. Nobody commented on it. Nobody needed to. Adaptation was a language older than speech. At the 30-kilometer mark, the Kethren tried one more time. A second mortar team had worked its way south along the eastern ridge, past the section Hollies had collapsed, through whatever goat path equivalents the Kethren scouts used, and set up a firing position above the plateau's southern descent. The first round landed 200 meters ahead of the column's lead element. The second landed 100 meters closer. The column stopped. Veshkari moved to Morrow's position. The Draivek officer's chitin was scored and cracked across most of his dorsal surface. His compound eyes had lost their polished amber sheen. They were clouded with dust and micro-scratches from the desert wind, and they moved with a sluggishness that suggested the officer was operating on the Draivek equivalent of the last reserves. But his voice was steady. "They are bracketing the descent. If we proceed, we will be in the open." "How far to the relay from the bottom of the descent?" 11 kilometers. "And from here?" 13, but the plateau is no longer tenable. They will bring more tubes forward. Morrow set down the harness. His shoulders didn't thank him for it. They registered the absence of load the way a circuit registers the absence of current as a condition, not a relief. He looked east at the ridge. He looked south at the descent route. He looked at Hollies, who was already reading the rock, her eyes tracing fracture planes along the plateau's eastern rim like a woman reading sheet music. "Hollies, what have you got left?" "Nothing good. My charges are gone. I've got deck cord about 20 meters. 3 blasting caps and a cutting torch." "Can you do anything with the ridge?" "Not with deck cord, but I can do something with the descent." She pointed south, where the plateau dropped toward the lower ground in a series of step terraces, natural basalt shelves carved by erosion, each one a few meters wide and a few meters lower than the last. "See those terraces? Each one is a natural fighting position. If we bound the column down in stages, one platoon covering while another moves, the mortar team has to relocate between shots because the angle changes with every terrace. They lose their template every 60 seconds. That's not a plan, that's a fighting retreat. That's what we've been doing for 11 hours, Sarge." Morrow looked at Alvara. The explosive specialist was standing motionless, her empty charge racks hanging from her vest like the skeleton of a plan that had already been spent. Her sidearm was in her hand, not aimed, just present. "Alvara, you've been watching the Kethren scouts all day. How do they reposition?" Alvara's answer was immediate. "In pairs, one observes, one moves, leapfrog pattern. They won't advance past a ridgeline they can't see behind. When Hollies collapsed that section, the rest of the scout line stopped for 7 minutes before they found a way around. They're cautious. So if something unexpected happens on the ridge, they freeze." "For a few minutes, yes." Morrow picked up the harness again. The blood-crusted straps found their grooves in his shoulders like old boots, finding familiar feet. "Then here's what happens," he said. "Alvara, you take Hollies' deck cord and the cutting torch and you climb that ridge, not to blow it, to burn it. Set the deck cord in a long line across the ridge face, light it and let it burn. It won't do damage, but it'll look like a demolition prep. The scouts see that, they freeze, they report back. Their mortar team displaces. That gives us a window." "How big a window?" 5 minutes, maybe 7. That's not enough time to get the whole column down the terraces. It is if the Draivek bound by platoon, and the humans take the litter straight down the center. Veshkari, who had been listening, spoke. "Straight down the center is the mortar's primary axis of fire. Not during the window, that's the point." Silence. The thoracic harmonics had stopped. The entire column was listening, not because they could hear the conversation, but because soldiers always know when the plan is being made. They feel it in the way the officers stand, the way the air changes weight. "Lieutenant," Morrow said, "I need your people to trust a plan that isn't in their doctrine." Vishkari's compound eyes locked on his. The rotation stopped. The facets held still for the first time all day, and Morrow saw in them something he'd only seen once before in a Draivek officer's eyes, on Thessic 4, when a Korvathi fire line had broken, and a single Draivek platoon had held a bridge for 9 minutes longer than physics said they could. "Decision. My people," Vishkari said, "have been watching your species carry our wounded for 11 hours across terrain we classified as impassable. I do not need doctrine to trust that." He turned and began clicking orders. The descent was chaos and geometry in equal measure. Alvara went up the ridge with 20 meters of det cord and a cutting torch, moving with the patient, precise economy of a woman who had spent her career making the earth do what she told it to. She laid the cord in a visible line, not hidden, not tactical, deliberately placed where the Kethren scouts could see it. Then she lit the torch and held it to the cord's end. The det cord burned bright, a line of white fire across the ridge face, throwing sparks and smoke, and the unmistakable signature of a demolition preparation. Every sulphurous eye on the eastern ridge locked onto it. The mortar team displaced. Morrow moved. He pulled the Vari's litter over the first terrace edge and let gravity take it down the 6-foot drop, controlling the descent with the harness and his own body weight as a brake. His boots skidded on the stone. The litter runners shrieked against the basalt. The Vari's mandibles locked tight, her compound eyes wide, her clicking rapid and involuntary pain, and something else, something that might have been the Draivek version of holding on. Behind him, 1st Platoon bounded down the west side in a textbook leapfrog fire team covering, fire team moving, each team dropping to a new terrace and scanning before the next team advanced. 3rd Platoon mirrored them on the east. The formations were ragged, heat-worn, scratched and dusty, but the training held because training always holds when it's the only thing left. Ewan brought Kethari's litter down the center behind Morrow. The medic's face was a mask of dust and dried hemolymph, and his hands left bloody prints on the harness straps, but he moved with the same relentless, unthinking forward motion that had carried him for 26 kilometers. His boots hit each terrace, absorbed the impact, and pushed on. His eyes checked Kethari's dressings between drops. The medic never stopped being a medic, even when his body had stopped being a vehicle and had become something closer to a function. At the 3rd terrace, the mortar team realized the det cord was a decoy and resumed firing. The first round hit the 2nd terrace, where no one was anymore. The second hit wide to the east, scattering stone across 3rd Platoon's descent route. The third hit the center 10 meters behind Ewan. The blast lifted the rear of Kethari's litter and slammed it sideways into the terrace wall. Ewan went down. He hit the basalt with his left shoulder and rolled, and for 1 second Morrow thought the medic was finished. Then Ewan got up. He got up the way humans get up, not because the damage assessment had been completed and the result was favorable, but because getting up was what you did when getting up was what was needed. He grabbed the litter. He pulled. Blood ran from a cut above his right eye, and he didn't wipe it because his hands were on the straps, and the straps were the only thing that mattered. 2 more terraces, 2 more drops. The mortar rounds walked south, correcting, but the angle was wrong and the terraces were natural defilade each step, putting another shelf of basalt between the column and the burst radius. The rounds landed high, showering the column with stone fragments but not fragmentation. At the bottom of the descent, the plateau gave way to lower ground, a broad, rocky plain that stretched south toward a low rise on the horizon. And on that rise, catching the late afternoon sun like a signal fire, the communications array of the coalition relay station. 11 kilometers, visible, real. Morrow hit the plane and kept pulling. The flat ground was a gift after the terraces. The litter runners found smoother stone, and the friction dropped and the pace increased, and for the first time in 11 hours, the math started working in their favor. But the math was not done with them. At the 34-kilometer mark, the Kethren's main column reached the edge of the plateau behind them. Morrow heard it before he saw it, the low, grinding rumble of armored vehicles climbing the scree fields, the clatter of heavy infantry dismounting onto the basalt surface. The Kethren had cleared both narrows, bypassed the collapsed ridge section, and worked their way south at a pace that said they were no longer in a hurry because they believed the retreating column was finished. They were almost right. The column was moving at something less than 2 kilometers per hour. Draivek soldiers were supporting each other in pairs, and triples heat casualties sagging between their squadmates, chitin plates chalky and dry, mandibles clicking in the slow, erratic rhythm of systems running on reserves. The 2 Tessavari civilians had been absorbed so thoroughly into the formation that Morrow could barely distinguish them from the rest of the column. They moved the way the soldiers moved. They endured the way the soldiers endured. The column had made them part of itself, and itself included everyone, and everyone was still moving. Ewan had not spoken in 90 minutes. The medic's face was a mask carved from sunburn and stone dust, his eyes fixed on the litter in front of him, with the tunnel vision of a man whose world had contracted to the width of 2 harness straps and the distance between 1 footfall and the next. His hands had stopped bleeding an hour ago. The blisters had broken and dried and reformed and broken again, until the skin on his palms had become something new, not scarred, not healed, just changed. The way materials change under sustained stress into configurations their designers never intended. He was still checking Kethari's dressings, every 300 meters. The interval hadn't changed since kilometer 1. Morrow had noticed that. The frequency of care hadn't degraded with the medic's body. The protocol was mechanical now, independent of the organism running it, a program that would execute until the hardware failed, and the hardware was a 24-year-old from Gansu who had decided that failure was not in the instruction set. At the 36-kilometer mark, Morrow heard something he didn't expect. Music. Not human music, not melody in any sense he recognized, but the thoracic harmonics that had been building in the Draivek column all day had reached some kind of resonant threshold, and the sound that emerged was structured. Not speech, not communication in the way that the translation membranes were calibrated to parse. Something older. A vibration that started in Veshkari's thorax and propagated through the column soldier by soldier, each body adding its frequency, each frequency reinforcing the others until the harmonic was thick enough to feel in the soles of Morrow's boots. The basalt carried it. The air carried it. It was the sound of a formation that had stopped being an organizational unit and had become something the Draivek language probably had a word for, but that the translation membrane could not translate because it wasn't a word. It was a state, a condition of collective being that the Draivek achieved when their doctrine failed and their math broke, and they had nothing left except each other and the sound. Morrow pulled to that sound for 5 kilometers. At the 38-kilometer mark, the relay station's automated perimeter turrets detected the column's transponder signatures and logged the approach. At the 39-kilometer mark, the station's garrison commander sent a scout vehicle to make visual contact. The vehicle, a light coalition transport with coalition markings, and a crew of 2, crested a low rise ahead of the column and stopped. The crew sat in the vehicle for 11 seconds without moving. Morrow knew what they were seeing. A column of battered, dust-caked Draivek soldiers supporting each other across open ground. 2 elderly Tessavari civilians walking in the center of the formation. A young human medic hauling a litter with blistered hands and blank, focused eyes. A woman with a dislocated shoulder reset in the field and an empty demolition kit. Another woman standing watch with a sidearm and empty charge racks. And at the center, a combat engineer with 2 lines of dried blood running from his collarbones to his shoulder blades, harness straps bonded to his skin, stone fragments in his back, pulling a Draivek corporal on a litter made of mining rail and tactical webbing. The vehicle's driver keyed her radio. Morrow couldn't hear what she said. He didn't need to. In 60 seconds, the relay station's gates would open. In 90, the medical team would deploy. In 3 minutes, the first of the Draivek casualties would be on a surgical table. But that was 60 seconds from now, and 60 seconds was 60 meters, and 60 meters was 60 pulls on the harness, and Morrow counted each one. They made the relay at 1847. 11 hours, 41 kilometers. 4 humans pulling Draivek casualties on improvised litters across broken basalt under indirect fire in desert heat that cracked the soles of Ewan's boots and blistered the skin on every exposed surface of Morrow's neck and forearms. When the column crested the last rise and saw the relay station, a prefabricated coalition communications hub with a perimeter of automated turrets and a garrison platoon, Morrow's legs stopped working. Not gradually, not with warning. They stopped the way a circuit breaks a clean, total cessation of input. He went to his knees, then forward onto the harness, and hung in the straps like a man in a parachute that had already touched ground. Ewan was beside him in 2 seconds. The medic's hands were blistered raw, his face burned dark, his uniform stiff with dried amber hemolymph. He unclipped Morrow's harness, eased him to the ground, and immediately keyed the relay station's medical channel. Draivek hemolymph types, wound classifications, surgical priorities. The flat efficiency of a man who had memorized an alien species' medical protocols because that was his job, and he did not do his job halfway. Hollis was sitting against the relay station's perimeter wall, her reset shoulder braced against the composite panel, her eyes closed. Her good hand rested on the empty charge rack beside her. She wasn't sleeping. She was doing something that looked like sleep the way a dormant volcano looks like a hill. Alvara was standing. She was always standing. She stood at the station's northern perimeter and watched the corridor's mouth, 12 kilometers out, where the dust of the Kethren advance hung against the late afternoon sky. Her sidearm was in her hand. It wasn't tactical. It was personal. 4 hours alone in a canyon with nothing but explosives and rock mechanics, and she was not yet willing to let the canyon go. Vishkari found Morrow on the ground. The Draivek officer stood over him for a long moment. His chiton was scratched and cracked, dusty in every joint, scored by a day of terrain that his species had never evolved to endure. His compound eyes moved slowly, taking in the human the blood-glued harness marks, the stone fragments lodged in his back, the sunburned skin peeling on his forearms, the legs that had hauled 60 kilograms of alien casualty for 41 kilometers and then quit like a switch being thrown. 47, Vishkari said. Morrow looked up. What? 47, the number that walked out, all of them, every soldier in the column, including the 2 your doctrine forbids you from leaving. My doctrine doesn't forbid it. My doctrine doesn't address it. Then what does? Morrow lay on the packed earth. Above him, the sky was turning the color of burnt copper as the Verasi 3 sun dropped toward the canyon walls. Everything hurt, but the pain was abstract, now a report from a distant outpost that he would process later, or not. Habit, he said. Vishkari made the sound. The low, sustained harmonic that Morrow had been hearing all day. But this time it was joined by another harmonic, and another Draivek soldiers nearby adding their resonance, one voice at a time, layering overtone on overtone until it became something Morrow could feel in his sternum. A vibration that bypassed the translation membrane and communicated in the only language that didn't need one. Not words, not meaning. Just acknowledgement from one kind of soldier to another, for a thing that doctrine couldn't compute and math couldn't justify, but that had happened anyway, across 41 kilometers of stone. We have served with 9 coalition species, Vishkari said. His voice was quieter now. The clicking beneath it had slowed to something that sounded almost like punctuation. All of them received the same briefing. The doctrine is rational. The math is clean. Every species reads it. Every species follows it. He paused. The harmonic deepened. Except yours. 20 meters away, Corporal Dhavari was being transferred to a surgical litter by a medical team working with the quiet speed of professionals who understood that the soldier on the litter had been marked for abandonment by her own doctrine and carried 41 kilometers by someone else's. Her compound eyes found Morrow across the distance. The clicking from her mandibles had changed slower, lower, a pattern he'd never heard before. He didn't know what it meant. He didn't need to. Leave her, Morrow said quietly. That's what the math said. Yes. I'm not very good at math. Veshkari was silent. The harmonic built. The desert wind pulled the day's heat out of the canyon in slow, steady breaths, and somewhere north, in the narrows where Alvara had rearranged the rock, the Kethren advance had stopped. On the surgical litter, Dhivari's compound eyes caught the last light. She was alive. Between her and the corridor's mouth, scored into 41 kilometers of basalt by mining rail runners and the refusal of 4 humans to solve for the acceptable loss, the trail ran unbroken, a line in the stone that no doctrine had written and no math could explain, but that 47 soldiers had walked from end to end without losing a single one.